Hello and welcome to the IND podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Dunicic. Before we begin today, subscribe to our channel to stay in the loop and join our growing international community. Now, our main story today is again going to concern the Russo-Ukraine crisis and the growing tensions there. But we're going to focus on one specific thing that has been a major focus of media debate. The difference between United States official reactions and Ukrainian official reactions and NATO official reactions to Russian tensions and how they are treating the situation. Now, there has been a huge disparity from how the West is treating the Russian threat and how Ukraine itself has been treating the Russian threat. Now, notably, during this entire situation where Russia has amassed more than 100,000 troops on Ukraine's border and entered a diplomatic feud with NATO, prompting tensions to rise and the belief that a Russian invasion could potentially be coming very soon, has had different reactions from different nations. Now, the West has treated this as if Russia can invade at any moment. We can wake up one morning and Russian tanks will be in the capital city, Kiev. Now, Ukraine, notably, has been extremely calm. Much like my Hawaiian shirt here, they have been unbelievably relaxed to a point where it's almost disturbing. Now, while the United States has used language like a very distinct possibility of invasion or potentially imminent or coming any day, Ukraine's officials have stated this is nothing out of the ordinary. This is nothing different from the last 8 years, and this is nothing special. So the United States is saying, oh my God, Russia's going to invade at any moment, while Ukraine is saying, nothing going to happen. We're very safe. No one invade us. So that brings the question, who is right? And why is there such a major difference between opinions on two countries, or we're counting the United States, Ukraine, and NATO. So three different international entities who should be on the same side. Why is there such a major difference of opinion? Now, fundamentally, a lot of this comes down to different perceptions in terms of how to act internationally. Now, the United States believes that Putin's interest is to destabilize Ukraine and destabilize the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and extend and consolidate his geopolitical sphere of interest in Central and Eastern Europe. The best way to do this would be to gain a foothold in Ukraine. The most direct way to do this would be to invade a certain portion of Ukraine. The reason that the United States and its NATO allies believe that this is a very real possibility is because 8 years ago, Putin fucking did that. Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and gave support to pro-Russian separatists in the eastern regions of Ukraine, of Donbass. Now, in the eastern regions of Ukraine, there is still a war going on. Now, in 2015, the Minsk Treaty was signed, which kind of put this war in a bit of a stalemate and stagnation. There is no excessive fighting anymore, but people are still dying, and there are still sniper shots and pot shots being taken from one side to another. This eastern conflict in Donbass has killed around 14,000 people, 3,000 of which have been civilians. So the potential for conflict or invasion is very real because there is a historical precedent. Now, Ukraine's leadership believes that Russia's interest isn't necessarily to invade Ukraine. While obviously that would be beneficial to Russia if it could avoid having Western sanctions levied against it, Russia would prefer, as Russia has stated, to do so without committing an invasion. Now, the best way to take over Ukraine, Russia doesn't necessarily have to invade Ukraine, take over the capital city of Kyiv, institute its own regime. What Russia can instead do is destabilize Ukraine. And the best way to do this is economically. Now, keep in mind, Ukraine has been an independent country for 30 years. It is still one of the poorest. Some people believe it is the poorest country on the continent of Europe. Now, it needs to be understood that when I say poorest, that idea is relative. And economic situations and the quality of life in Ukraine varies dramatically. Cities like Kiev, Odessa, Lviv, and Kharkiv have what is not completely equal to Western Europe, but they have a relatively decent standard of life in the larger cities. When you leave the larger cities in Ukraine and you go outside into the villages and see what people outside of the city are living like, the standard is something that is almost comparable to, sub-Saharan Africa poor. So the reality is Ukraine fundamentally as a country, when it's not worried about a potential Russian invasion, is focused on its economic development, which has been rapid. Ukraine, because of its extremely low taxes and lack of government regulation, which in this case is a very good thing, and despite its high level of corruption and bureaucracy, has managed to create a capitalist utopia. Not literally, that's going too far, but a place that attracts a lot of foreign investors. Now, because of this, Ukraine's economy has been incredibly dependent on more and more foreign investment, especially in industries like IT, energy, and other modern sectors. Now, the thing about foreign investors is no foreign investor wants to put their money into a literal shit show. So the whole purpose of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and his other ministers has been to promote a station of calm, to calm investors and not have them remove their investments and their money from Ukraine. Because the reality is Putin can and Russia can achieve their exact same goals of an invasion by, in the long term, destabilizing the economy of Ukraine, causing major economic problems, financial issues for the people of Ukraine, and instead investing money in disinformation campaigns and promoting pro-Russian candidates to come to power, take over the government of Ukraine, and work in Russia's interest. That is just as effective, though it takes much longer, to do for Russia's interests. Now, that is Ukraine's stance. And the reality is that's probably pretty true. That is an option for Russia. Destabilizing Ukraine is another option instead of just outright invading it. Now, the other thing is motives. Now, the United States and its Western NATO allies have different motives than Ukraine. Now, the motives of the United States and NATO are to promote the image that Russia is an immediate and extremely dangerous threat to Ukraine. And the reason for this is not because the United States is evil or wants to scare people with propaganda or make people panic. Panic is helping them achieve their goals, but that's not their main goal. The main goal of the United States and the West is to promote Russia as a threat, to ensure that all of the countries of Europe that are in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization alliance are going to act in accordance with Western sanctions against Russia in the event that it invades. Now, keep in mind, the genuine perception of the US and its Western allies is that invasion is a very real possibility. Now, the United States and most other NATO countries have stated that not a single soldier of theirs is going to set foot in Ukraine. And that is very important to understand. While the West can provide Ukraine with weapons and financial support for its military, it will not be sending direct military aid, such as soldiers or intervening, because obviously everyone wants to avoid a world war. And that is very bad for Ukraine. While Ukraine's military is not a laughingstock compared to Russia's, it is not comparable. The Ukrainian military has significantly less soldiers. The weapons are completely less advanced than Russia's high-tech weapons. Russia has one of the world's, probably equal to the United States, technologically advanced military apparatuses. Ukraine cannot compete with that. And finally, Russia probably doesn't even have to use its advanced military technology or a high amount of soldiers because it completely outmatches Ukraine in terms of air power and naval power on the Black Sea. Ukraine would not be able to stand a long chance against Russia. The only possibility of fighting for their own independence and fighting against the Russian invasion in Ukraine would be civilians, so normal everyday people, carrying out a long-term insurgency and draining out the will of the Russian forces, politicians, and people fighting in the nation. Now, that is dark. Insurgencies are dark and cost a lot of lives. So Ukraine fundamentally cannot fight Russia. And if Ukraine loses to Russia, that is a huge loss for NATO. So what the West can do instead, if it's not sending troops, is enact massive amounts of sanctions that would cripple Russia's economy. But doing so would also hurt the West. So in order to do so, the United States and NATO need to make sure that every single ally that is in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, especially the countries that are in Western Europe, are completely aligned with US sanctions. That is why, publicly speaking, Russia has been painted as this massive, extremely aggressive threat that is just itching to invade Ukraine and start a war. Now, Vladimir Putin has stated that he does not want to invade Ukraine and he does not want to cause a war. And that has been the guiding principle of Ukraine's leadership, which has said, listen, Yes, there's soldiers on our borders. Yes, we're fighting a war in eastern Donbass. Yes, this is not good, but it's nothing that we haven't experienced before. And look, Putin has said he doesn't want to invade us, but something fundamentally needs to be understood. People do things they don't want to do all the time. Going to the dentist, attending your dumbass kid's parent-teacher conference, staying in a loveless marriage even though it's going in no direction. The reality is people will do what they need to do even if they don't want to do it. I personally don't believe that Russia wants to go out of its way to invade Ukraine, and Russia is going to buy its time before it has to come to such a decision, and that is a last-ditch effort. But is Russia willing to invade Ukraine if it has to? Fuck yeah, it will. That is a reality that needs to be understood, and that's where the truth is. Like in most situations, it lies somewhere in the middle. Ukraine's completely laid-back response to these tensions is not accurate, while the Western panic-raising pandemonium and alarm-ringing is also not accurate. But both have an instance of truth in it, and picking from each side builds this central truth. That is, Russia is currently trying to destabilize Ukraine and test the solidity of NATO's alliance. And that might be all it needs. But if Russia does need to create an invasion to enact its geopolitical interests, it will. So the last question that we leave ourselves with is, what do the Ukrainian people want? And what are they feeling? Now, most people in Ukraine are genuinely concerned, and they do believe that war is a possibility, a Russian invasion is a possibility, but they're not panicking, okay? They're not panicking, they're not worried about it, and the reason that they're not is most people need to understand that Ukraine has been at war with what they view as Russia, or the pro-Russian separatists in the eastern region for the last 8 years. This is nothing new for them. But what these people want is they want peace. They don't want a higher level of war, and they don't want the continuation of what's going on in the East. You have to understand that many Ukrainian servicemen, young brothers, husbands, sons, friends, loved ones, are fighting in eastern Donbass. And many Ukrainian people are thinking, if Russia invades, innocent civilians will also have to fight too. No one wants to lose their friends, relatives, or themselves in a war. They fundamentally want peace. And Volodymyr Zelensky campaigned on finding diplomatic solutions for tensions with Russia. That is a key aspect of his campaign, of his presidency, and of his promise to the people. Now, at the same time, Zelensky, during his campaign and throughout his presidency, has promised that he will not back down to Russian concessions and demands, which puts Zelensky in a pretty tricky situation. He cannot give in to Russian demands, and there is a quick solution to these tensions. By following through on the Minsk Treaty Agreement, which we covered yesterday in our episode, but the Minsk Treaty Agreement did stipulate that Ukraine would give autonomy to the eastern Donbass region, while also providing complete amnesty from criminal prosecution to all of the separatist rebels in the region. Now, Ukraine can do that. Zelensky could do that, and that could potentially decrease tensions. But Zelensky also has to understand his promise to the people of Ukraine. And the people of Ukraine are very suspicious of Russia. And there is an old saying in most Slavic countries: if you give a pinky, they're going to want the whole hand. And that is why Zelensky is not going to roll over. But at the same time, he's not going to promote this kind of war with Russia. Now, at the end of the day, the US and the West believe that Russia is going to potentially invade Ukraine at any given moment because that fits its interests. Ukraine believes that Russia is just trying to destabilize Ukraine's economy and is instead pushing for a calm picture and stating that everything is okay to maintain foreign investments, which are absolutely necessary for the economic development of the country, to continue its growth, which goes along Ukraine's interests. Now, Russia just wants to fill out its interests any way it can, ideally without an invasion, but if it has to, it will invade. And the Ukrainian people just want fucking peace. Now, how is this situation going to fundamentally develop? In my honest opinion, I don't think it's going to result in any kind of invasion or something so dramatic. Instead, this is going to be a long, drawn-out, slow, of diplomatic tensions and standoffishness that's going to expand over the next period of weeks, if not months. There will be no immediate catalytic invasion. This is just going to be a diplomatic, tense standoff for at least the next few weeks, if not the next few months, before eventually being resolved in a diplomatic manner. But that's what I believe. Thanks for tuning in. I want to remind you to like, comment, and subscribe. And finally, let me know what you think. What do you think about the situation? Do you think that the United States is correct in believing that a potential invasion by Russia is imminent and that Ukraine is not taking things too seriously? Or do you think that Ukraine is more correct, that the reality is Russia is playing a long game and that an invasion is not a top priority for Russia and that people should be a little bit more calm when approaching this situation? Let me know in the comments. I'll see you